So, welcome to the latest in Sustainable Investor series of interviews with leading asset owners. Our spotlight today falls on Canada, its pension model, and the particular transition challenges facing its economy. Canada's larger pension funds have won plaudits globally for their ability to deliver stable and attractive returns. This has been achieved partly by venturing further up the value chain than asset owners typically do. The UK has looked to replicate this success through consolidation. But what scope is there for smaller asset owners to adapt these strategies? At the same time, Canada's pension schemes are pushing along the pathway to net zero transition, which has its fair share of challenges given the role of extractive industries in the Canadian economy. To cover these and related issues, I'm joined by Barbara Zvan, CEO and President of the University Pension Plan of Ontario. Thank you for your time, Barbara. I'd be grateful if you could start us off by introducing yourself, introducing UPP, and also perhaps mentioning some of your roles beyond the firm.
Well, thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here. So my background is I have been in pensions for almost 30 years. So I've been at the University Pension Plan for about 5, which is a really unique experience. We were created to really be a startup pension plan, which is kind of a unique idea. You don't get too many startup pension plans, and its first day was January 1st, 2021, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. But prior to that, I was at one of those really large pension plans, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, for about 25 years, and I left being the Chief Risk and Strategy Officer. Along the way, especially over the last, say, 8+ years, I have been doing a lot of work with the federal government, first through its expert panel on sustainable finance, whose chair is now the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin. And the follow-on effort, which was recommended in that panel, called the Sustainable Finance Action Council. And there we really brought 25 Canada's leading financial institutions together to make really clear recommendations to the government. And I'm sure we'll hit some of those during our conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Now, we're kicking off on on a theme that really kind of was inspired by a paper that you co-wrote recently, looking at direct value creation by Canada's pension funds. Before we dive into UPP's kind of approach to adapting adopting some of those themes, rather, could you explain a little bit more about the concepts in broad at a broad level?
Sure. So the direct value creation, it's a fancy term, but really it covers what the large pension plans in Canada were doing, say, over the last 20, 30+ years. So typically when the pension plan started out, take Ontario Teachers in 1990, it was just started by the government. It was seeded with 100% bonds that you actually couldn't sell. So it had pretty humble beginnings. It wasn't the organization that it is today. And we really had to set course on how are we going to manage this money for the long term, and how are we going to do it in the best interests, our fiduciary duty to the plan members. And so you had some advantages, right? You had a big pool of assets, you had a long horizon, we had strong governance at the board, and so we really embarked on, how do we manage this money professionally, just like any other asset owner and manager with a large pool of assets. And one of the things we took advantage of was the fact that we could do direct investments. We could partner with GPs through the world and other asset managers. We could do co-investments with them. We can hold those assets for a long time, and we could do directs. And in many ways in the paper, it was kind of coined as taking out some of the middleman or middle person along the way to help reduce the fees. And it provided a lot of advantages, right? It allowed us to do, I would say, a better risk management at the total fund. So we were able to get exposure to really critical things like inflation protection through the infrastructure and real estate portfolio. It gave us the ability to be on those boards and influence the value creation and the risk management along the way. It allowed us to take advantage of the liquidity premium, so extra return, which was solely needed because these pension plans have to take risk to meet their pension liabilities and to keep it affordable. and the cost efficiency around doing some of it yourself. So that really motivated the change. And it didn't happen overnight, Chris. Like this was a 20 plus year journey, and every pension plan has taken it and evolved it. And we're evolving it here at UPP.
Excellent. So that gives us a kind of a good kind of starting point for UPP's own journey. You're looking to develop a kind of a flexible direct value creation strategy. Be interesting to get a sense of the kind of risks and opportunities that adapting and adopting this strategy hold for UPP, and how you're managing those.
Yeah, so key difference in University Pension Plan or UPP is, our size. We are about 13 billion Canadian today. We were created to bring the university sector pension plans together. And we started with 3 universities. We have been growing about 1 a year and consolidating a lot of smaller employers that have never had access to pensions. So not the same size bucket. So I spent 25 years in a large pension plan, used to the $100 billion type of situations. And so the first thing I did was call friends. I knew a lot of the friends who ran mid-sized pension plans and said, so what are you doing? How are you adapting it? And what I found was a lot of them, after about 10 billion, started doing co-investments and doing it slightly differently though. At this size, you got to be selective with focus. So you can't do, as many sectors as possibly a large pension plan. Because one of the key risk management attributes of doing private deals, that you are tied into for a long time is having that deep sector expertise up front in your risk management and your assessment. So you can't be in as many sectors, so you really needed to focus. And you need to be in a different size bucket. So we are really focused on the mid-market. This is not a space where it's cost effective for the larger pension plans to be in. And so we took those and we said, okay, we can do this and we can show that we are a good partner. We can be clear on what we're looking for and help develop those relationships along the way. In terms of, what do you do in terms of having a small team and all those things, you have to think a little bit differently in terms of how do you keep that institutional knowledge going because it's a long-term hold. How do you keep that partnership with the GP going so there's some redundancy in the team in terms of managing the asset? But you also need a really strong pit crew, Chris. These don't happen just by the investor teams alone. You need the strong legal group, a strong tax group, a strong operational due diligence group, and RI group, all to be supportive and to be along the way.
Okay, I mean that gives a kind of great idea of the kind of resources that you need, the relationships that you need, the focus that you need. Are there kind of sector specialisms that you would kind of point to that you've developed?
Sure. In infrastructure, for example, definitely focused on climate aligned solutions. So both in terms of green assets, so pure renewables, as well as transition assets. If I look at real estate, real estate is very expansive. So we are focused on the developed markets at this point, but very much in the residential and industrial areas and staying away from retail at the moment and other things. We just can't spread ourselves too thin. And so definitely around PE, much more the mid-market buyout, who are capital light type area. And then we're just starting to approach, where do we focus in private credit? So maybe I can tell you in a little while.
Okay. And how do you kind of incorporate or take account of the kind of management of sustainability related kind of risks and impacts alongside this kind of overarching approach?
Sure. So when we started, we decided that we were going to incorporate ESG from the get-go, right? No point doing all this and then turning around a couple of years later and saying, oh, now it's time, right? We had to start this from the beginning, just as important as any other factor. So, our focus is first to do a very thorough due diligence up front. And many of us who came here came from large larger pension plans, so we had a good sense what good looked like and the skills and capabilities that you had to have in place. And the partners you also need, not just in, can't just do it alone. You need partner law firms, you need those specialty skills and put all that in place. But in terms of engaging with managers along the way, we make it very clear that we're willing to work with the manager in their journey to advance their capabilities. But if I take climate as an example, we have on our website a climate investment transition framework. We say at this point we are willing to work with managers who acknowledge it as a systemic risk and that it is financially material, and they make some sort of commitment, whether that's a net zero commitment or a commitment to disclose the materials emissions in their portfolio to us. So that's the starting point. And then we work with them every year, just like we work with corporations on engagement, and say, what are the one or two things that you need to improve? So someone maybe early in the journey could be their RI policies need a little bit more heft. Maybe their governance structure need a little bit more heft, or maybe they're a little bit further and perhaps in real estate infrastructure, are they leveraging industry standard benchmarking like GRESB that we use to compare managers? So it could really focus on what they need, but it's continual and it's to ensure progress.
As you mentioned that you've been up and running for a relatively short period, around 5 years,
Yep.
and I guess it's kind of fast growing. There's universities joining all the time, and obviously kind of assets are growing. And I was just wondering what the pros and cons of that situation are in terms of, particularly when it comes to the kind of integration of and taking account of climate and other sustainability factors into UPP's investment processes.
Yeah, so we started, just to give you a little context, on our official start date was July 1st, 2021, right in the middle of COVID. And my wife came about a year before, and I went, oh dear, we have a lot to do, and called many friends across the street and said, okay, we need to get this going. And we quietly worked and merged the three founding universities' portfolios together. So think about when you have three houses and you're trying to downsize to one. You have a lot of the same, but not maybe fit together. You have too many things of one thing. And so a big focus was, okay, we inherited all these different managers. How do we make it more efficient? How do we make it more cost effective? How do we make it manageable to oversee it? And so that was a really big focus at the beginning. So we inherited the portfolio. So that was a plus or minus, it was a good base, let's just say. But we had no people. We had no technology. We had no policies or processes or frameworks, which is a little daunting considering we were all virtual. But in many ways, it gave us a blank sheet of paper. And we really could start how we wanted to from the beginning. So everyone we hired is very aligned to what we're trying to do around the integration of material ESG factors into the investments. We would say it's a talent attractor to say that you're going to focus in these areas, that you get very keen talent. And, other than spending a lot of time, roll up the sleeves, spending time with managers, saying to many managers, sorry, time we're departing, I think it's generally a positive experience.
Presumably, in terms of that kind of relationship with managers, presumably as the team and the expertise has developed in-house, your needs and relationships with those managers must have evolved similarly.
Yeah, so we started off with first, let's just get our hands around this portfolio. What do we need in terms of the asset mix? We needed more inflation protection. We needed to line the bonds. So there was a lot of conversation in terms of how do we do this effectively? How do we do this and position ourselves so that we can move forward in a more active manner? And then we started in 2022, late 2022, to do our first co-investment. Right. So you have to put all those pieces in place. So it really was an evolution in terms of how do we build these capabilities. The other thing that we've been quietly doing so that we can actually own our proxy votes and actually apply our own exclusion list on companies we think are need to be excluded for financially material reasons is actually changing from generally pooled vehicles to segregated vehicles. Many don't appreciate that you can't do a lot of things if you're in pooled vehicles, right? This is where everybody gets the same versus segregated where you can customize. So that has also been something we've been quietly doing in the background as well, so that we can actually vote the way that we want and exclude the way we want and engage directly with companies.
I guess a further example or evidence of this the kind of growing maturity is I guess the increasing kind of transparency and clarity in terms of expectations of firms in your portfolios from a kind of climate and sustainability point of view. So it'd be useful to get a kind of sense of how you feel that has evolved to date and how you expect your stewardship approach with corporates to evolve over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, so stewardship plays a really important role. If you look at our investment beliefs, which is one of the first things that we did with our board and the team, the second one talks about how, for us to be successful, all the systems that we rely on need to be healthy, and that is the financial system, the environmental system, and the social systems. And we have therefore think about the impact of our investments on those systems. So we are not impact investors. We don't do concessionary investing, but we have to be thoughtful. So that really forms the base. So if we take climate, we focus on what's material. So if we take climate as an example, we focus on collaborative engagements. We are a small player with a small team, so collaborative engagements are absolutely key. We participate, we help steer Climate Engagement Canada, which also launched October 2021, completely virtual. And we launched with 27 investor participants, and we are up to 57. And we've been slowly adding. We've been involved with the IIGCC one for the banks, and as well as Climate Action 100 Plus and others. So what's the commonality? They're really, really focused. Each one has a clear focus and area which helps the people participate. We agree that it starts with governance, then strategy, then what are those relevant targets, disclosure, and then aligning their advocacy or lobbying. Those themes, I think, Chris, will stay, right? But what is the expectation for each of them will keep increasing, right? The expectation around disclosure. So I think in terms of bringing engagement along, we will stay there and we'll stay very focused. At some point, you have to ask the question, is it worth it, right, with those companies? But at the same time, we're also bringing along our proxy voting. So maturing and advancing how we vote for directors. Do we think they're actually overseeing this risk? That's a very powerful tool. This year, we launched our first shareholder proposal with Couche-Tard, and asking them to really outline how they're managing their different emission scope 1 and 2 and their approach to scope 3. Right. So again, taking the next step and doing that ourselves, right, while being in this collective engagement initiative. So I think what you're going to see is a really continued focus in this area, focus on those material companies, on the material issues, and expectation to see progress.
Now, you gave a couple of examples of some of the common traits of the kind of collaborative initiatives that you've been part of. So, does that kind of lead you to kind of believe that that whilst we're very aware that kind of collaborative initiatives have had a rough kind of 18 months or so, that you think that those kind of principles of focus and governance should be sufficient to make sure that that collaborative engagement does have a kind of future in how asset owners pursue sustainable investment.
Yeah, so focus is a key thing because you're trying to get a big group of investors from all parts of the world together, and you want to make sure that they can all align on those objectives. So we talked about the strategy, the governance, all that for the climate. I think the other realities we have to, and back to the jurisdictions that they live in, they all live in different rules and different cultures and norms. And so one size does not fit all in terms of how to participate, and maintaining flexibility into how they participate and how they contribute, I think is key. And so, and we have to acknowledge, asset owners aren't necessarily seen as competitors, where in the private space, these are competitive entities with shareholders and a lot of rules and laws around them. So, and also different time horizons. So we need to make sure that we're flexible. And I would say in Climate Engagement Canada, we started with investor participants, and they were focused on the Canadians who can have a big role. And then we moved to international supporters who are coming in a slightly different way, just to help, make sure that we work in a way that supports all of them. I would say the other aspect is that you need support to do these engagements, Chris. It's a lot of work, right? So even for larger organizations where I was before, so these teams need support. So coordination is one, but it's also education. So investors are typically much more generalist than those companies. Those companies know their business in great depth. So you need to make sure that you support these teams with deep dive research, you know, um, I would say, research in key targeted areas like, say, CapEx alignment. Like, we do not see any Canadian companies report around how they align CapEx. Can we do a deep dive to inform our conversations, right? And you have to do this without, competitors sharing competitive information, right? So you have to do it in a way that, enables them to participate. So that's really key. So supporting the engagement teams and doing it on the topics that they need. So we survey our engagement teams on what are those topics and provide that to them. The other thing you need to do for these organizations is when they go and they say, okay, you're spending X on this initiative and you're spending all this time, are you having impact? And so you have to measure progress. And that's why the benchmark assessment element of these initiatives are so important, to be able to say, here's where we're seeing progress and it is worthwhile endeavor to spend our time and effort on these things.
So there's a good sense of the kind of the evolution of the engagement exercise on an ongoing basis, the monitoring, the kind of the sharing of the information, the building up of the
Yeah.
expertise. And I guess one of the kind of other evolutions of kind of stewardship amongst asset owners has been the development of engagement activities beyond the corporates, for example. It'd be interesting to kind of get a sense of how important a role you see that side of things playing in UPP's approach to stewardship.
Oh, that's a great observation. So most people talk about engagement with corporates, and we've already touched on how we engage with asset managers. Maybe one of the reflections from the expert panel on sustainable finance, we used to always, as the panel members, get the question like, whose job is it? Like, who's responsible for making these changes? And we're like, everybody's. Everyone has a role, and government has a big role in an enabling policy environment. So we know today there's many sectors that can't profitably transition, right? They can't, but they're also responsible for profits to their shareholders. So how do you create that enabling environment? And that's often a big role of government. And then generally, what I think for investors right now, we view that government's going too slow, right? And so, and I also learned through the expert panel, we live in different worlds. We talk differently. We spend, we think differently. And so there is huge value in continuing the sharing of market insights and to make sure that government puts in policies that actually work for the investors. So I think that's an element that people maybe don't always appreciate. And to be honest, when I'm in the government world and I listen to them, it's not my world either. And so to appreciate what they are up against and what they need to do and consider so that we can help them better. And so I think that continuous sharing back and forth is important. So similar to corporate engagements, the objectives have to be focused. The engagements have to be multi-year, repetitive, lots of sharing. Government is huge. Don't assume one part shares with another part, right? You also have to take in the practical realities of the jurisdiction. So Canada, everyone thinks of Canada, okay, federal, Mark Carney. Canada's a federated system, right? So if you take disclosure and you want to actually meet the objective that was put together by that Sustainable Finance Action Council, those 25 institutions, you actually have to get 30 changes across the board, right? So the government has to change their Canadian Business Corporations Act. Every province has to do that as well. Every security regulator and every of our 13 jurisdictions have to do it as well for our public companies. And to impact folks like us, pension regulators, you have to impact the provincial pension and insurance regulators. So when you add them up, that's 30. That is very different than in the US and very different than the circumstances in Europe. So not only are you having conversations, Chris, with the federal government, but you're having conversations with all those provinces, and you have to start with, who are logical to change. So I think it's a very exciting area, I think, of investors coming together. And it's really important, like the local investors can provide the insight, but it's really important for the government to hear from the foreign investors. How they view Canada outside in, not just environmental issues, but on economic issues, social issues too.
Indeed. So we realise that there's structural reasons why it's a kind of particular challenge for Canada to affect its net zero transition from a kind of regulatory policy perspective. But obviously, it is an economy that has its kind of fair share of extractive industries and carbon intensive industries, and I know I guess that's a good reason why Canada's approach to its developing its taxonomy has been quite transition focused.
That's right.
I was just wondering what your kind of thoughts are on where Canada stands in terms of its net zero transition from that kind of policy perspective.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because Canada, we really should be more leading in this space than we are, given how much time and effort has gone into it. So let's look at the positives. So we have the Canadian Sustainability Standard Board that adopted the ISSB standards S1, S2 late last year. So that was fantastic, right? It was good progress. OSFI, which is our main financial regulator of the largest banks and the largest insurers, they have something called B15, which really goes to climate risk, and that's progressing really well. SFAC, which was that group of 25 financial, it made some very clear recommendations. So disclosure across the board, private, public for the larger companies, as well as you noted, the transition taxonomy, which was the work stream that I led. And it was really, as you said, dealing with Canada's realities, right? Mm-hmm. We have a lot of sectors that cannot transition smoothly. Those were two elements that the federal government announced last year at PRI in person that it was going to proceed with in the way that they can. And Mark Carney's platform also noted that they were going to have the taxonomy done in the priority sectors for 2026, which is around the corner, and start issuing transition bonds of $10 billion in 2027. So all great. I think the Action Council has wrapped up, but there's been a follow-on effort, and that follow-on effort has many of those same members, and it's focused on the next step, Chris, which is what does good transition plans look like? Mm-hmm. So taking those base disclosure and taxonomy, which is great to see that continued collaboration. So those are all positives. And the one unique thing maybe I'll call out for Canada, we're a big country. We have lots of regulators, as I noted, to get that disclosure in, but we have a very concentrated financial system. So you can probably get 90% of the financial system with 25 CEOs in a room. Mm-hmm. So that's how we affect change, right? On the negative side, or the side that maybe has the gaps, is our Canadian Securities Administration, which is the group that brings all the security regulators together, put disclosure requirements for public companies on pause and just encourage voluntary adoption. And that was a surprise, I would think, for most investors. Um, and the trade issues are real. Canada exports a significant amount, much more than the UK and Europe, to the US. And so that is taking up a lot of time and attention for corporations, for financial institutions aboard, as well as our federal government. And so I think that the reality is, somehow we got to keep this progress going. And maybe there's a small group that can continue working on this while others focus on the trade issues. But the challenge of Canada's implementation is just too slow, right, at the moment.
Well, it seems that like asset owners in all many jurisdictions, I guess that there's that element of having to deal with kind of multiple issues and making sure that sustainability really kind of it becomes entirely kind of embedded in each aspect. To ensure that the momentum is really kind of maintained rather than
Yes.
the focus being diluted.
Yeah, this is a continuous evolution journey, right? Even when you build a taxonomy. And kudos to Australia. They took our framework, they advanced it, they did 6 sectors, and by the way, we'll borrow it all back so we can have a running start. But it's a continuous effort, right? So even if you set it today, in 5 years, you have to update it. And so you need this ability to have um, a group, an institution, an institute own it and just continue to evolve it while our policymakers, our governments are focused on the problems of the day, which are significant. And that's really, I think, one of the key steps that Canada needs to move forward on is who owns some of these elements, who can help work with industry to keep advancing transition plan guidance, for example, versus being a voluntary effort that is really supported, I would say, largely by foundation funding. Um, and that is definitely you need that focus. You need those people with those expertise to move this forward. And I really hope to see that we get that in Canada so we actually can contribute to the whole transition taxonomy effort. I think Australia is doing a great job. There's interest in Brazil and other places. So, we will work to ensure interoperability as well.
Well, that's a good international angle to end things on. So, Bob, thanks for covering so many topics with such thought and detail over the last half an hour or so. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. And I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation going with you.
Thanks.